So the Paranoia registry is a new way to look at pancreas fistula and to overcome some of the issues that we've got with understanding pancreas fistula better. So the key line is don't be paranoid, improving outcomes through better understanding of pancreatic fistula. Paranoia may be a strong word, and some of our colleagues are very confident in their technique, shall I say. But I think for most of us, we recognize that uncomfy feeling we have when we do the same technique on two patients who are very similar, and one has a fistula and one doesn't. And we're left wondering just why, the fistula has happened. So Paranoia is an international registry, and it will provide, the primary purpose is to provide surgeons with their own pancreas fistula outcomes, and importantly, risk-adjusted outcomes. And it's also a novel platform to explore risk factors and conduct clinical trials. So why do we do this? Well, as we know, pancreas fistula is the main cause of morbidity and mortality after pancreas surgery, and it has a significant impact upon healthcare providers and costs of healthcare. We performed and published this study, looked at 15,000 Whipples in the UK. It goes back a little bit, but 90-day mortality over that period was 6.5%. And this is not too far off other international national studies. And what we know from this nice body of work by Chuck Vollmer is that mortality frequently follows, a fistula, and a fistula is the trigger for complications and bad outcomes. So why do we need a new format? Well, there's a great definition of pancreas fistula from the ISGPS, and we have a good understanding of risk factors. But we have little understanding of surgeons' outcomes, and I don't mean really from me looking at somebody else or somebody else looking at me, but we don't have a good understanding of how one surgeon is performing, how another is performing, and what characteristics a surgeon who has a low fistula rate may have compared to a surgeon who has a higher fistula rate. We really don't have a handle on this. If we could understand that, then maybe we can start to define what things really make a difference. We don't have a tool that can help us observe how a change to our technique affects our own outcomes, and we don't know what the optimal outcome is. And I'm going to present to you data that I don't think randomized trials will give us that answer. So a little bit about adjusting fistula outcomes. So this is data from our unit in Birmingham. We performed this analysis a few years ago, and we have over 500 Whipples, 3 experienced consultants, and 5 consultants who joined the unit as newly appointed consultants during the study period. The experienced surgeons, as you can see here, have a fistula rate of 10.7%, whilst the newly appointed surgeons, it's more than twice as high at 25%. And if we just take 2 examples from this group, and we have no risk adjustment, and we look at cumulative fistula, you can see here that this surgeon has a much higher fistula rate per patient than this surgeon. So what would you do with that problem? Is it a problem? Do you have to stop this surgeon operating? Do you need to retrain them? Or is this person so fantastic that they're an outlier? Well, actually, if we perform a risk-adjusted QSUM plot, what we can see is that the experienced surgeon is probably an outlier. They have a very good performance, and they have far fewer fistulas, 10 fewer fistulas, in fact, than you would expect by the time they've operated on 50 patients. And although this new surgeon had an excess of 2 fistula after 10 patients, actually, they got over the learning curve quite quick, and they appear to be developing characteristics of a more experienced surgeon quite early in their career. The other thing that we can do with a QSUM is we can reset it to 0 every time you change technique. So here you can see this surgeon had a run of 3 fistulas and then changed their technique. They had a run of 4 fistulas with their next technique, but stuck with it and actually seemed to have pretty good outcomes. and then changed their technique for a third time, that kind of steady state continued. And here you can see acquiring characteristics of our more experienced consultant colleague after around about 60 operated patients. And just example of QSUMs from the experienced surgeons, all showing fairly similar characteristics, and pooled data for experienced surgeons and new surgeons. And what we can see is evidence of a nice learning curve here for the newly appointed surgeons. So the primary aim of Paranoia is to give surgeons this level of data. You put your cases in, we'll understand characteristics of the operation, and you can pull that data out. Importantly, you'll be able to explore the registry and look at operative factors. If you want to compare PG versus PJ, you can do that. If you want to look at what an internal stent versus no internal stent does, you can do that. Perhaps more importantly, particularly given the data that we've seen here on experience versus newer surgeons, you can select the data and benchmark yourself against your peers. So people who've either done the same number of career Whipples as you, the same stage in their career, or the same age, geographic location. Importantly, all data is anonymous and surgeons are not identifiable. So nobody can work out who you are from this data. It's entirely anonymous, patient and surgeon. So what data goes into the registry? Well, the problem with registries is we get tired of putting data in. So this is purely to give you risk-adjusted outcomes. So all we need are the factors to do that. When you sign up, we've organized the description of your operative technique in line with the Dutch group and the PAncReatic ANastOmosIs website. You'll also put in any mitigation factors that may help reduce fistula, such as internal stent, wrapping the falciform ligament around the anastomosis, and that kind of thing. And it means that every time you do a Whipple, you don't need to put this data in a second time, but you will be given the option to edit that if you need to. The factors that go in at the time of surgery or just after surgery are age, gender, pancreas duct width, body mass index, hard and soft, neoadjuvant therapy, and pathology. If you want the original FRS to risk adjust, then you put in estimated blood loss. But it is accepted that estimated blood loss is not always accurately recorded, and we have the AFRS tool in there. So the FRS is more of a historic thing because some surgeons learned to use that. And with this data, we can calculate FRS, AFRS, and the Birmingham score. So you can have scores for clinically relevant fistula and all pancreas fistula. I would recommend that you put the data in at the end of the operation when you write the operation note, and you'll be sent an automatic email reminder to complete the fistula outcome at 14, 30, and 90 days after surgery. And it's important just to double check at 90 days that your patient wasn't readmitted with a fistula-related complication, because you may complete your outcomes at 14 days saying no fistula or biochemic leak, but actually they may have been readmitted with a gastrointestinal bleed from a pseudoaneurysm at day 18. So it is important to recheck that at 90 days. So let's switch the view a little bit. So what's wrong with clinical studies? What's wrong with randomized trials? Well, there are several problems with randomized trials in surgery, but I'm going to show you that I think we have a particular problem of power with randomized trials of Whipple. So this is a meta-analysis performed by the trainees in the group, and it's really interesting. It's fascinating, really. So nearly 100 trials, and if we look at the median study size, let's look at clinically relevant. The median study size is 110 patients, so that's only 55 patients in a control group and 55 patients in the intervention group. And if we assume a fistula rate of 15%, and we're being generous because some centres the clinically relevant rate is just 10%, then that is just 8 events in a control cohort. Unsurprisingly, with such small numbers, almost the majority of trials are negative. And in fact, you would need to see a fistula rate of less than 1% in a study cohort this size to see a significant difference, which is probably unrealistic, because if an intervention was that effective, it would be standard practice. And in fact, if all you wanted to do was see a 25% reduction in fistula or 50%, you actually need a few thousand patients or 700 patients. And in fact, if you wanted to see a 75% reduction in fistula, you need 268 patients. So I think there is an issue. I think studies that have been published to date are largely underpowered, and they typically produce a negative result. And if we look at the data on the right, it kind of shows the scale of the problem. And what the trainees did here is they took the rate of fistula in the control group, and they performed a post hoc power calculation on that cohort. And you can see what sample size will be needed to see a 25, a 50, or a 75% reduction in fistula in the intervention group. And you can see here that almost all studies are underpowered, and very much so. And some studies require huge sample sizes based on their rate of fistula in the control group. So Paranoia will essentially bring together a network of surgeons across the world who are doing surgery and recording their practice prospectively. It's absolutely not compulsory, and it's purely optional, but those surgeons, if they want, can take part in research projects. We have created a separate retrospective registry. So if a surgeon who joins Paranoia has kept a logbook of all their procedures and has their risk factors and outcomes, you can easily send Rupali your data. She'll upload it into the retrospective registry, and we can build a registry of operations and operative risk factors. But if we look at the prospective registry, then although there aren't many factors being collected from each operation, there's more than enough to compare operative techniques, 1-layer, 2-layer, external stent, the use of somatostatin analogs, these kind of things. And so we can analyze the data that is in the core registry. The next thing that we can do is somebody may propose a study, and it will go through a process. And if it's approved by the steering committee, then there will be an additional data set, and you'll have the option to put data into that data set if you want. So for example, if somebody wanted to know what the role of postoperative inflammatory markers were as predictive factors for clinically relevant fistula, you may be asked to collect CRP and white cell count and temperature on postoperative days 1, 3, and 5, for example. So for a time-limited period, there would be an extra data set. We would power that study. So once we've recruited enough patients to analyze that data, then that data set, that option to put extra data in, disappears. The data goes back to the team that proposed the study. They analyze it, and they would publish that data on behalf of the Paranoia group, and any surgeon that puts in data would be a recognized author. So a time-limited, prospective, observational study. And then the ultimate question is, can we use this platform to trial interventions? So, could we change practice? Could we change operative technique? Could we add an intervention? Could we change a somatostatin analog and observe the effect or impact of that upon fistula outcomes? There are multiple benefits. This would be an international, flexible, and transparent process. Collaborative authorship recognizes the surgeons who take part, and there's a steering committee to oversee and ensure quality. issues with recruiting patients, with numbers, with costs, are largely overcome by these collaborative models. Rupli is also organising and it is well on the way to creating a platform for trainees to record their own pancreas anastomosis outcomes. So as you can see here, this is data from our unit where trainees were compared to consultant surgeons, and we can see that they perform anastomosis very well. So the trainee can use this data and go to their trainer and say, look, I'm doing fine. Why don't you give me more pancreas anastomoses to do? And this is important because we've shown through systematic review that trainees tend to be given low risk glands. So if they can do well with a low risk gland, perhaps it's time that we start to give them more high risk glands. The trainee Paranoia platform also breaks the Whipple operation down into its individual stages, and trainees can record the components of their operation and look at how they're progressing over time. So we have an international steering committee of experts to oversee processes and quality. We're endorsed by the EAHPBA, and we're looking for, we're working with IHPBA to get endorsement there, as well as having endorsement from various national societies. Several systematic reviews and meta-analyses have been conducted to underpin the processes and what we've done so far. And this is just a schematic to show the overview of what we want to do. So the objectives and the preparation is here. Here is the core registry. Here are the studies that will run in parallel, which are time limited to the registry. The surgeon has their risk adjusted outcomes, and we hope to leave a legacy, which will be the international registry, a novel tool to study pancreas risk factors, and a tool for surgeons to critically appraise their practice. There's a couple of studies being worked up which you may want to contribute to, or we welcome your comments on. Adiposity is a clear risk factor for pancreas fistula, and body mass index is in various risk scores, for example. But what we've noticed is that when Asian groups publish on this topic, adiposity is less of a strong risk factor for pancreatic fistula. In fact, in some groups, body mass index is not a risk factor for fistula. Now, if we're going to produce and provide risk adjustment and risk scores, well, they need to be applicable the world over. And so we're proposing an international study, and we're taking all measured values of adiposity and looking at these in the study to see if, regardless of race, there is or ethnic background, there is an optimal measure of adiposity. And so if you're interested in taking part in this study, Rupli is working with a Japanese group to define the factors, and we would look forward to doing this prospective international study in the near future. I mentioned earlier the retrospective study. So if you have your operative logbook electronically going back from when you started as a consultant, you're very welcome to input the data, and we can look with risk adjustment to assess for learning curve and what the variation between surgeons is in that learning curve, and maybe what characteristics of training are associated with a quicker learning curve, or what operative or organizational factors are associated with a faster or slower learning curve. And there's absolutely no data on this whatsoever. So another opportunity for an early output from the group. So the huge amount of work has has taken place already. Rupali has led on all of this. She's created the website, she's created the registry, and she's led on the systematic reviews and meta-analyses. I'm very grateful to our steering committee who help us in all our processes, and we meet on a monthly basis to update and make sure we're making progress.